Thank our witnesses for being with us today on the occasion of this truly historic hearing. And we know it's taken a lot for you to get here, and we appreciate very much your being here and helping to educate Congress and the country about what's going on in Texas. Before we get into that, though, I want to take a moment, and I think it's not inappropriate, to mark the passing of a great voting rights hero and a great hero of mine, Bob Moses, who died on Sunday. And Bob Moses was a graduate student in mathematics and philosophy at Harvard in 1960, when he opened up the newspaper and he saw pictures of students sitting in from North Carolina AT&T at lunch counters in the South. And he said, "Those students look the way that I feel." And he knew that he had to go down south to participate in the civil rights movement, the struggle for people to be on a plane of equality as citizens. And when he got down to Mississippi, he thought he was going to be involved in a movement to try to desegregate the lunch counters and the restaurants. And he talked to a man down there named Amzie Moore, who was the head of the local NAACP, and he said, "You know, we don't really need people sitting in the restaurants and lunch counters." And Bob Moses said, "Well, what do you need?" And he said, "Well, when you look around, what do you see?" And he said, "I see beautiful terrain and trees and people." And he said, "This is a congressional district that is 2/3 African American, and less than 1% of the black people down here are registered to vote because of the grandfather clauses and the literacy tests and the poll taxes. And the local Democratic Party, a racist party structure, has excluded African Americans from voting." And that's what launched Bob Moses on his crusade with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to desegregate Mississippi and Alabama and the rest of the South and the country. And it was that struggle that gave us the phrase, "one person, one vote." Each person has a right to vote. And of course, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee organized people to register at great personal risk. Bob Moses was nearly killed several times by Klansmen, by sheriffs, by people who came to attack him. Of course, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman were killed during the Freedom Summer that SNCC organized. But Bob Moses never gave up the struggle for people, for people's voting rights, and went on also to create the Algebra Project, saying that the right to know mathematics is also a fundamental civil right in our country. So I wanted to note that and observe that, and I wanted to start on a bipartisan note that the struggle for the right to vote has been a struggle against all political parties in our history, and nobody has clean hands here when you look at it historically. The question is whether we are willing to commit ourselves to a struggle that extends the right to vote for everyone. It's not a partisan question. It's a question about small d democracy for everybody. So earlier this year, legislators in Texas unveiled perhaps the most aggressive set of proposals for voting restrictions anywhere in the country, 65 different anti-voter bills, dramatic restrictions on mail-in voting, vastly increased criminal liability for people who help their family or their friends to vote or bring their ballots to the mailbox, increasingly stringent voter ID requirements, and more criminalization of what goes on in the polling place, enhanced protections for partisan poll workers who set out to intimidate voters, and additional limits on how election officials encourage voters to participate. At one point, and somebody's going to have to explain this to me, it's made a crime to encourage people to vote. I think if I'm reading this proposal correctly, they make it a crime to encourage people to vote. I don't see how that possibly can square with the First Amendment of the United States. I openly encourage people to vote all over the country and in Texas right now. Can that actually be a crime, to do it either on TV or in the social media or in person, talking to people, encouraging them to vote? There was even, I think in the first draft of this legislation, an effort to restrict early voting hours on Sunday, a clear attempt, at least as it was read in Texas, to undercut and hamstring black churches, which ran souls to the polls turnout operations. All of this is taking place despite zero evidence of mass voter fraud in Texas. None of it. Lots of invocations of integrity of the ballot, purity of the ballot. Well, those are code words that go back centuries now. I mean, some people see impurity of the ballot when they see people they don't like voting. So we want to get to the bottom of that. Is there widespread voter fraud in Texas that this is responding to, or is something else going on? One thing I read about was that a Texas legislator introduced just this month a bill calling for a forensic audit of the state's 2020 results, but only in large counties won by President Biden. And when asked why he had not included all the counties in Texas, he said, quote, "What's the point? I mean, all the small counties are red." How can that be consistent with our bipartisan, I'll go beyond that, partisan commitment for everybody to have the right to vote unimpeded without jumping through all of these hoops? Democratic state representatives in Texas, including our witnesses today, organized a walkout in May to deny Republicans a quorum at the end of their session, preventing passage of the voting bill that would strip their constituents of access to the ballot. In response, Governor Abbott convened a special session on July 8th to pass this sweeping, draconian new election overhaul. Democrats once again denied the legislature a quorum, this time by coming here, petitioning the U.S. Congress for a redress of grievances, demanding the attention of a country that is committed to fairness in voting, to come to urge us to protect their voting rights. And they've done this at great personal cost, at great personal risk, by leaving their families behind. And I, for one, salute them for their courage in being here today. But blocking a quorum is not a permanent solution to the problem of efforts to disenfranchise people and suppress the vote in America. They're here to ask us to act, and we must pass the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. The cost of inaction will be devastating for our democracy. The voting restrictions in Texas will strike at the heart of democracy in that great state. Restrictions on voter assistance will potentially criminalize normal interactions between friends and family members who may require assistance to cast a ballot because they're not proficient in English, because they need a ride to the polls. It could have devastating consequences, especially in the Latino community. You cannot out-organize a law that criminalizes you for trying to help your grandmother vote. Limits on what local election officials can do to prevent intimidation by partisan poll workers will also leave minority voters vulnerable. Just last year, leaked video showed GOP Texas officials aim to organize election integrity brigades of 10,000 largely white poll watchers to monitor communities of color in Houston. Imagine how many brigades there will be once poll workers have, as the ACLU of Texas puts it, a one-time get-out-of-jail-free card for voter intimidation. Because there's a remarkable provision, I've never seen anything like it, in this legislation which says that a partisan poll worker cannot be removed from the polls until they've already been warned once for violating the law. So they get one free bite at the apple to violate the law, and I do want to ask the witnesses about that. Finally, this bill prohibits reforms that were successfully implemented last year by Harris County, such as drive-through voting and 24-hour voting, that were mainly utilized by African American and Latino voters. The Texas Civil Rights Project estimates that over half of all ballots cast using those methods were cast by voters of color. So this zealous pursuit of a massive draconian crackdown on voting is now a national crisis. According to the Brennan Center, 18 states have enacted 30 laws restricting voting rights so far this year. More are on the way. Congress has to act. We have a responsibility to guarantee the people of the United States a Republican form of government. And I'm sorry, my dear friends, that's not a capital R Republican, it's a small r. It's a Republican form of government, a representative form of government where everyone can vote and participate. And they can choose Republicans or Democrats or Libertarians or Independents, whatever else. But the point is, the people get to decide. We don't get to micromanage and gerrymander the electorate. We have to fight back against this new campaign for voter suppression, sparked by the big lie, the same big lie which brought chaos and violence down on this institution and this Capitol just 6 months ago. And for anyone who has not watched our valiant police officers describe what took place on that day, I beseech you to do so. Regardless of what you think your views are now, I beg you to go and watch what they went through as they were assaulted with baseball bats, steel pipes, flag poles, bear spray, mace for 4 or 5 hours defending our democracy. And all of that took place to so-called stop the steal in the name of the big lie, which is that President Biden did not actually defeat Donald Trump by more than 7 million votes, which he did. This wave of legislation, I think, grows out of that same poisonous soil of the big lie. The future of democracy is in our hands. So with that, I offer my friend, Mr. Sessions, the time that he needs to make his opening statement, and then we will go to our witnesses. Mr. Sessions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.